Ever get that feeling, like when you look back at your relationships and you start to see a pattern, and maybe not a great one?
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been there.
Well, that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've
Definitely.
got some really interesting research and insights that can help explain why we might end up in these same cycles over and over again.
Right. Like, what's the psychology behind it all?
Exactly. But even more importantly, how can we break free and move towards healthier relationships? That's our mission today. We really want to break down these complex ideas so that everyone listening can understand these patterns and hopefully make some positive changes.
Absolutely. It's all about recognizing those repeating dynamics. Like, have you ever felt like you're stuck in some kind of romantic Groundhog Day?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Well, you're not alone. And the research we're looking at today really dives deep into these recurring behaviors, the familiar roles we play and those predictable outcomes. Sometimes they're good, but often, like we're talking about today, they can be pretty draining. The key is to recognize those patterns. That's the first step.
It's not just bad luck, right? Like, if you always seem to end up with partners who are emotionally unavailable, or maybe they're overly critical, or you just feel like you're constantly giving more than you're getting, that's probably not just a coincidence.
Yeah, it's usually not just a random string of bad luck.
Exactly. The material we've been going through suggests that there's often a very clear, recognizable cycle happening.
Right. And what's fascinating is that these cycles, they often have roots that go way back. One of the articles we looked at actually highlighted just how much our past experiences can influence our relationship choices in the present. Think about it. Early childhood, the way we connected with our caregivers, even past heartbreaks. Those will be a lasting impact.
I see. So it's almost like they create a blueprint for our future relationships.
Yeah, kind of. For example, let's say someone had a parent who was emotionally distant.
Right. How might that affect the kind of partners they choose later in life?
Well, think about it. If your primary caregiver wasn't really emotionally available, you might have learned subconsciously that love is something you have to work hard for, or that maybe emotional closeness isn't always reliable.
So it becomes almost like a defense mechanism.
Exactly. And then as an adult, this can lead you to seek out partners who kind of mirror that emotional distance. It might even feel strangely familiar.
Even if it's not healthy.
Exactly, even if it ultimately leaves you feeling unfulfilled. There's this kind of comfort in the familiar, even if it's not good for you.
That makes sense. It's like we're subconsciously recreating a dynamic that we already know, even if it wasn't a positive one.
Right.
Another point that came up in our research was this idea of growing up in a really chaotic environment and then mistaking drama for passion in adult relationships.
Oh, that's a really good one. It's so common. If your early life was full of emotional ups and downs, a lot of conflict, that might have become your normal.
Right, it's all you know.
Exactly. And it could even feel like a sign of intense connection.
Right, because you associate those intense feelings with love.
Exactly. So then when you're in a relationship that's actually calm and stable, it might feel, I don't know,
Boring.
yes, boring, or like something's missing.
That spark.
Right. And so you might, without even realizing it, seek out or even create drama, mistaking those big emotional swings for passion and excitement.
So interesting. It's all about reframing what we perceive as healthy.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, one of the core themes that kept coming up in all of this research was the importance of self-worth. It's
Definitely.
huge. And what I found really fascinating was this idea that if you don't truly believe you deserve a healthy, fulfilling relationship, you might be setting your expectations way too low.
That's exactly right. Low self-worth can really hold you back in relationships. When you don't value yourself enough, you might start to believe that you don't deserve to be treated well.
Or that you constantly have to earn love and affection.
Yeah, like you have to prove yourself worthy. And this can lead you to settle for partners who don't really meet your needs.
Or tolerate behaviors that you would never accept from anyone else.
Exactly. It's like you're giving them a free pass because you don't believe you deserve any better.
And what about those red flags that pop up early on in a relationship? Little warning signs that something might not be quite right.
Oh, yeah, those are important.
I noticed that a lot of the research talked about how low self-esteem can make us brush those red flags aside.
It's like we minimize them or try to rationalize them.
Exactly. Like, oh, it's probably nothing, or maybe I'm just overreacting.
Yeah, instead of seeing them as clear signs that something's wrong, someone with low self-esteem might think, well, nobody's perfect, or maybe if I try harder, things will get better.
It's like they're trying to protect the relationship, even if it's not good for them.
Right. Because the idea of being alone or feeling unworthy can be even more scary.
Now let's talk about boundaries.
Okay, yeah.
This is a concept we hear a lot about, but our research really emphasized how crucial they are.
Absolutely essential, especially if you're trying to break free from those negative cycles.
Right, because boundaries are essentially those rules, often unspoken, that define what you're okay with and what you're not okay with in your relationships.
Right. They're like your limits. And for people who keep finding themselves in unhealthy relationships, setting and maintaining those boundaries can be so hard.
Oh, I can imagine.
They might struggle to say no, feel super guilty when they put their own needs first, or even worry that setting a boundary will make the other person leave.
Like they're walking on eggshells all the time.
Exactly. Afraid to upset the balance, even if the balance is harmful to them. And one thing that the research really drove home is this. Healthy love respects
Yes,
boundaries.
sir.
If you're with someone who's always pushing your limits, ignoring your no, or making you feel bad for having your own needs, that's a huge red flag.
It's a sign of disrespect.
Absolutely. It means they don't respect you, and the unhealthy patterns are likely to continue.
Okay, I want to talk about this next idea because it was so interesting and kind of surprising.
Okay, what is it?
It's this idea of subconscious attraction and something called trauma bonds. Have you heard of that?
Yeah, trauma bonds. They're really powerful.
Can you explain what they are?
Sure. Basically, a trauma bond is a really intense emotional connection that can develop in relationships where there are cycles of abuse, neglect, or extreme emotional highs and
Like
lows.
that push and pull dynamic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing is, sometimes we mistake that intense emotional roller coaster for genuine closeness and intimacy, but that pattern, of conflict followed by making up can create a really strong but unhealthy bond.
It's almost addictive.
It is. There's actually research that shows the neurochemical responses during those cycles can be very similar to addiction. Like the really good moments after a period of negativity can feel so amazing that they overshadow all of the bad times.
So you kind of forget or downplay how bad things were.
Yeah. And your brain actually gets used to those emotional fluctuations.
Wow.
It starts to crave them. And the constant drama can actually feel exciting in a weird way, even though it's really harmful.
That makes so much sense. It explains why it can be so hard to leave those on-again, off-again relationships. It's not just about the people involved. There's this deeper psychological thing happening.
Absolutely.
Okay, the research also outlines some common unhealthy relationship patterns that tend to repeat.
Right. The classic ones.
Yeah, let's go through a few of them. The first one is the repeated heartbreak cycle.
Ah, yes. This is when you always seem to end up with partners who disappoint you, let you down, or just break your heart.
Right, like you're constantly getting hurt.
Exactly. And a lot of the research suggested that this pattern often points to some unresolved self-worth issues.
So it's like deep down, you believe you deserve that kind of treatment.
Yeah, or you might be unconsciously replaying familiar patterns of disappointment from your past. There
Mhm.
might even be a weird comfort in that familiar pain, even if it's not what you consciously want.
It's crazy how the subconscious works, right?
It really is.
Another pattern that stood out to me was the caregiver complex. We all know someone who always seems to be trying to fix or save their partners. What's going on there?
Well, the caregiver complex, it often comes from this deep need to feel valuable and needed. For someone in this pattern, their self-worth might be tied to their ability to help others, even at the expense of their own needs.
So they get validation from taking care of people.
Exactly. And it can also be a sign of codependency.
Right, where you're overly reliant on the other person.
Yeah, it's like an unhealthy attachment. And while offering support in a relationship is great, of course, it becomes a problem when it's a constant pattern.
When you're always putting your partner's needs before your own,
Right, and you're always trying to fix them.
instead of letting them be responsible for themselves.
Exactly. It's not your job to fix your partner, and your worth shouldn't be tied to that.
So true. And finally, there's attraction to unavailable partners. This seems like such a common one. Why are some people consistently drawn to those who are emotionally or physically out of reach?
I think this one often ties back to that belief we talked about earlier, that love is something you have to earn.
Like you always have to be chasing it.
Exactly. If you grew up feeling like you had to work really hard for affection, you might subconsciously look for partners who are distant or challenging to connect with.
Because it feels familiar.
Right. And the pursuit itself can feel like love. Then when that partner finally gives you some attention, it's incredibly rewarding.
Even if it's fleeting.
Exactly. It's like reenacting that old dynamic of having to strive for love and approval.
Okay, so we've talked about these cycles and where they might come from, but how do we actually break free? The research offered some great practical steps.
Absolutely. It's not hopeless.
What's the first step?
The most important thing, and several of the articles emphasize this, is self-awareness.
So understanding your own patterns.
Yeah, you need to step back and really look at your relationship history. Start to identify those recurring themes.
Like, what are the common threads?
Exactly. Keep a journal, think about your past experiences, or maybe even talk to a therapist. Those can all be really helpful.
It's like becoming a detective in your own love life.
That's a great way to put it. You got to find the clues and connect the dots.
And once you start to see those patterns, what's next?
Well, the next step is to address and heal the root causes.
Right, because just making changes on the surface isn't enough.
Exactly. You need to dig deeper. Look at those early childhood experiences, past traumas, big heartbreaks, all of that.
It's about understanding where those patterns originated.
Exactly. This could involve things like inner child work, processing past pain, or figuring out your attachment style.
Right, because your attachment style can have a huge impact on your relationships.
Absolutely. Addressing those underlying issues is key to changing your relationship patterns for good.
Now, we talked about boundaries earlier, but I think it's so important that we revisit it.
For sure.
It's not just a concept, it's an essential skill.
Totally.
So, for someone who struggles with setting boundaries, how can they start to implement them?
Well, it starts with recognizing your own needs and limits and what you value.
What are you willing to tolerate, and what are your deal breakers?
Exactly. And then learning to say no without feeling like you have to over-explain or apologize.
That can be so hard for some people.
It is, but it's crucial. It's also about putting your own well-being first. You have a right to have your boundaries respected.
And if someone doesn't respect them, that's a big red flag.
It is. It might feel uncomfortable at first, especially if you're used to putting everyone else first.
But it's so important for building healthy relationships.
Absolutely.
And then there's the work of cultivating self-love.
Yes, that's a big one.
I know it sounds kind of cliche, but the research really highlighted how crucial it is.
It's more than just bubble baths and face masks, although those can be nice.
Definitely.
Self-love is about accepting yourself, being kind to yourself, and respecting yourself.
It's about knowing your worth.
Exactly. And as you build your self-esteem, you'll naturally start to attract partners who reflect that.
Because you'll no longer settle for less than you deserve.
That's right. You'll be empowered to walk away from unhealthy situations.
It's about raising your standards.
Absolutely.
This next point is really interesting to me. It's about redefining what love actually means to you.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because sometimes I think we can get a really distorted view of love, especially if our past relationships have been chaotic or dramatic.
Definitely. If you've been in a lot of those emotional battlefield type relationships, you might have a skewed idea of what healthy love really is.
Right, you might think that drama is normal or even necessary.
Exactly. But the research encourages us to redefine love as something that feels safe, supportive, and consistent.
It's not about those constant ups and downs.
It's about mutual respect, trust, genuine care, and being partners.
It's about feeling secure and supported.
Exactly.
And at the end of the day, it really comes down to making different choices.
Right. It's about taking control.
It's about stepping outside of that comfort zone, even if it feels scary, and choosing partners who are good for you.
Partners who align with your values and your vision for a happy life.
Exactly. It might feel uncomfortable at first, but it's so worth it.
Definitely. And one piece of advice that really resonated with me was to take your time when getting to know someone.
Don't rush into things.
Right.
Yeah.
Give yourself the space to really see who they are and if they're a good fit.
It's about making conscious, intentional choices.
Yeah.
So to sum it all up from our deep dive today, it's clear that our relationship patterns can teach us a lot about ourselves. They often reflect our past experiences and how we feel about ourselves deep down.
Yeah, they can be really revealing.
But the good news is that we can break free from those negative cycles.
We absolutely can.
It takes honest self-reflection, a willingness to heal old wounds, setting boundaries, and making different choices.
And most importantly, it's about believing that you deserve to be in healthy, happy relationships.
Exactly. You deserve to be with someone who makes you feel good, not constantly drained.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. What would it feel like if love consistently felt safe, supportive, and truly nurturing in your life?
Really think about that.
And what's one small step you can take today, even if it feels a little scary, to start moving in that direction.
You got this.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.